I'm glad Andrea was happy to introduce me, even though I'm not the other Adam Levine. Sometimes I think my wife wishes that she could trade. So let's make sure the link works. And there we go. Thank you, Andrea, for the kind introduction. Thanks also to the Archaeological Institute of America for organizing this and the other lectures in its annual series. Although I never had the pleasure to meet Mr. Bentley, it is a privilege to speak in the honor of someone so actively involved with the AIA. The speakers that this lecture series brings in are terrific. Hopefully I live up to them, and I urge you all to come to future talks. Thanks also to the Toledo Museum of Art for co-sponsoring the lecture series and for its commitment to archaeology and ancient art history. The museum is an exceptional place, one of the very best of its kind, and is open to the public for free 309 days a year. I came to Toledo from a museum that had a $25 suggested admission fee, so the notion that a collection of this caliber can be free to the public at all times still blows my mind. In fact, after this talk, you can walk the galleries and see everything from Naturally Toledo, which I'm sure many of you came from, a show of local artists depicting the beauty of this city and its surroundings, to Love and Play, a pair of Fragonard paintings, which pairs Tiame's exceptional painting by the artist, Blind Man's Buff, with its pendant piece from the Thyssen-Bornemisza in Madrid, Spain. The show reunites these paintings for the first time in 25 years and is a must-see. But however much my boss may like that intro, that's not what you're here to hear me talk about. So let me turn to my topic, the development of Christ's earliest images. I want to begin with an experiment. Close your eyes and imagine the face of Christ. And you do have to close your eyes even if I can't see you. I'm going to know. Whether you're a Christian or not, you undoubtedly have some reference point for how Christ should look. Now open your eyes. Perhaps the image on the screen behind me is not a match for your vision perfectly, but it is, I would guess, rather close. The picture is a photograph of the actor hired to play Christ at the Holy Land Experience, a Christian theme park in Florida. The fact that the appearance that the park owners wanted for Christ is probably the same as almost all of your mental images is proof, more or less, that Christ's appearance is today largely standardized. Of course, there is some variation among images of Christ, but by and large, the actor captures what we consider the key features of his face. Shoulder-length hair parted down the center with a full contiguous beard and mustache. A walk around the museum, moreover, would suggest that the association of Christ with an image like the actor from the Holy Land Experience is not a recent development. Whether a modern painting, such as The Judge by Georges Rouault, painted in 1937, or the El Greco masterpiece, The Agony in the Garden, painted some 350 years earlier, the image you all associate with Christ has been with us for centuries, allowing, of course, for the stylistic differences that you see from era to era. Yet if you were to walk across the street to the glass pavilion, you would find a 4.5-inch glasswork that shows something different than these images. The scene, a so-called gold glass that would have adorned the bottom of a cup or bowl, shows Christ giving the law to Peter and Paul. The scene is usually called the Traditio Legis, the tradition of the law, and sometimes called God giving the law, or the Dominus Legem Dat. Although Christ retains his facial hair, the hair atop his head is in this instance short and unparted. The object was made in the 4th century, right in the middle of the period on which this paper will focus. That period, the 500 years between 200 and 700, is known as late Antiquity, and as the gold glass indicates, there was considerably more variation in Christ's image then than there is today. You will see much more of that in the slides to follow. In this talk, I want to introduce you to the major variants of Christ's image that were in circulation during late Antiquity, as well as where they came from. I also want to explain how, by the end of the period, Christ's image had become largely standardized. Before diving in, though, there are a few potential misconceptions I want to try and clear up. I'm an art historian, which can sometimes be a difficult thing to try and describe to people. Of my studies, more than one person has asked me, what are you going to do with that? My grandmother, at least several times. She still doesn't know what I do for a living. And those reactions are not entirely unwarranted. With my apologies to certain art historians, it is hard to imagine how some topics are particularly useful to the world. Fortunately, I never felt that my subject matter didn't matter. I felt like the study of the image of Christ was important. And the reason I felt that way, or at least, my dad's a psychiatrist, so I can rationalize anything, so at least the rationalization I came up with, was that I am studying the most important symbol of what is arguably the most important force in the history of the world to this point, Christianity. And this brings me to my ultimate point. The subject that I am about to discuss is by definition religious. This paper, however, is not a religious one, and that's an important distinction. Where I discuss theology and the image of Christ's relationship to it, the discussion is only meant to situate the development of Christ's image in its historical context. Nothing I say here will either support or undermine the beliefs of anyone in the audience. My only agenda is an objective study of this important image. Another way to think about what I'm saying, one I hope will resonate, is to remember that over the course of history, many different types of Christianity have existed. Today, there is generally a consensus on key theological issues, but even within this room, I am sure there are many different types of Christians, Catholics and Protestants amongst others. Indeed, these types even today have very different perspectives on Christ's image. Now imagine a world in which Christianity was not 2,000 years old, and the theology of the Christian religion was not nearly so well worked out. It should come as no surprise that there were even more different types of Christianity, all of which would have had slightly different thoughts about Christ's image. More on this in just a bit. This should not be controversial. We know that there were many discrepant forms of Christianity over the centuries, and each of them conceived Christ in slightly different ways. What I'm doing then, in short, is I'm taking a look at the historical development of Christianity, but I'm choosing to do so by looking at what is arguably its central image, the depiction of Christ. It is not an overstatement to say that Christ's image was absolutely central to the early church. Many of you will know that Christian doctrine asserts that Christ, the divine Son of God the Father, was incarnated and actually lived on this earth as a human being. Incarnate literally means in flesh or made flesh. Christ, in other words, was a corporeal being just like any of us. In spite of his humanity, however, Christ was also God. That is, Christ was both human and divine. While Christians today may take it as self-evident that Christ had coexisting divine and human natures, this so-called dual nature was not affirmed until 451 and was not a mainstream Christian belief until 553. In other words, for almost all of late antiquity, there were Christians who did not believe that Christ had a dual nature. For some, such as a sect called the Monophysites, Christ had only a divine nature. For others, such as the Nestorians, Christ had two separate natures that did not commingle. He was a man on earth and a God in heaven. Although these theological positions were eventually condemned as heresies, they nonetheless demonstrate the theological diversity among Christian beliefs in late antiquity. The museum's gold glass was undoubtedly made for a Christian, but was it made for an Orthodox Christian or one of these other varieties? How is the image of Christ operational in the debates over Christ's dual nature? The answer, simply put, was that if Christ were human, then he had an actual physical appearance that could be circumscribed in art. Images of Christ, therefore, were a type of proof of his human nature. But if images of Christ proved the existence of his humanity, how did the same images comment on his divinity? After all, a separate tenet of Judeo-Christian doctrine maintains that it's impossible to depict the divine in art. According to the second commandment, it would be idolatrous to make any graven image, that is, and I quote, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. How, in the apt words of the scholar Paul Finney, did the Christians depict an invisible God? Fortunately, we can start to answer this question with another experiment. As with the first, please close your eyes. Now imagine that all of us here in the peristyle are transported to another world, exactly like our own, except for one admittedly strange difference. There are no traffic signs. Clearly this just won't do. Without these signs as we leave the parking lot tonight, a very full parking lot, thank you very much, it's very cold outside, and drive home, we'll all knock into each other. Imagine we have to come up with traffic signage. What's the first image that pops into your head when you think about how we should design a stop sign? Open your eyes. This may not seem like a surprise at all, but it's actually quite astonishing. Remember, we had the opportunity to start all over again in this experiment. You could have chosen anything at all, a blue circle, a green parallelogram, or a gray hexagon. What you all did, and I bet nearly 100% of you did this, was without realizing it, you said to yourselves, our new stop sign should look like the stop sign with which I'm familiar. Now, when I was in graduate school, one of my good friends was from Zimbabwe. If I asked him the same question, do you think he would come up with the same image? I bet not. I bet he'd imagine the types of stop signs that he was familiar with. And as you can see, they look rather different. So now let's shift back to Christ. While many think the question late antique artists asked themselves was, how do we show a Christian God? I think the real question they asked themselves was, what do we want to show? As with the stop sign experiment, the answer that I'm going to try and convince you of is that the artists borrowed from existing imagery with which they were familiar. Although most people realize that the earliest centuries of Christianity coincided with the later centuries of the Western Roman Empire, most people forget that this means that the earliest Christians lived in a world filled with images of Roman gods, emperors, and philosophers, all of which, as we shall see, were important prototypes for illustrations of Christ. It was only natural that in their quest to depict their God, Christians would draw on the visual language with which they were surrounded. Some of you may have noticed that my argument that Christ's earliest images appropriated iconography from existing imagery makes a pretty large assumption. It presumes that we do not know how Christ actually looked, or at least that there was no imperative to depict him as he actually appeared. Not only is this true, but it is worth exploring a little bit further just how uncertain early Christians were about the image of their Savior. Only 3 methods available in antiquity could have preserved Christ's likeness: written descriptions recorded by individuals who had seen him, miraculous images that upon contact with his face might have preserved his visage, or portraits made during his lifetime. Photography and video were not available. Dealing with the written evidence first, Christ's appearance is described neither in the New Testament nor in any text, including the Apocrypha, until centuries after his death. The earliest texts to address Christ's appearance were written by a group of active Christian commentators, who've since come to be known as the Church Fathers. One of the chief concerns of these Church Fathers was to draw parallels between Christianity and the Old Testament, which was interpreted as a literal prefiguration for the coming of Christ and the redemption of mankind. Many early commentators of Christ's appearance, therefore, rely on the description of the Messiah recorded in the book of Isaiah. He grew up before the Lord like a young plant whose roots are parched in the ground. He had no beauty, no majesty to draw our eyes, no grace to make us delight in him. His form, disfigured, lost all the likeness of a man. His beauty changed beyond human semblance. The majority of the Church Fathers, following the excerpt above, suggested that Christ was ugly. The earliest advocate of the position, Justin Martyr, echoes Isaiah almost exactly. He had no form nor glory, and we saw him, and there was no form nor comeliness. His form was dishonored and marred. Irenaeus, Cyprian, and Novatian, a lot of who have names that I'm sure don't mean very much, but all very famous Church Fathers. Novatian himself was actually named Pope in 251, unofficially ordained Pope, shared this interpretation. Yet despite the explicit description of a Messiah without beauty in Isaiah, there was another Old Testament source that suggested that Christ was in fact beautiful. Psalm 45:2 records that you, referring here to the Messiah, surpass all mankind in beauty. Your lips are molded in grace, so you are blessed by God forever. In response to this passage, the 2nd century theologian Clement of Alexandria writes, "Our Savior is beautiful, to be loved by those who desire true beauty." Clement was joined by several other Church Fathers, most notably St. Basil, who refers to Christ's image as one of inexpressible beauty. That Christ was interpreted as being both beautiful and ugly underscores the ambiguity concerning Christ's image. Indeed, for some of the commentators, ambiguity was the most powerful part of Christ's image, since it allowed each individual to picture Christ however he or she liked. In the words of Cyril of Jerusalem, the Savior comes in various forms to each person according to need. Origen almost exactly echoes this sentiment. Although Jesus was only a single individual, he was nevertheless more things than one, according to the different standpoint from which he might be regarded. Nor was he seen in the same way by all those who beheld him. He did not appear in like fashion to all who saw him, but according to their several abilities to receive him. It seems clear enough then that there is no written account of Christ's image that remains from his life. What then of images that allegedly preserve his likeness? These images, the miraculous ones, known by their Greek name akropoietoi, which literally means images not made by hands, are supposedly imprints of Christ's actual appearance made through contact with Christ. Usually these imprints were made on cloth, although there are stories of some that were made on stone. Although numerous akropoietoi were mentioned in late antique texts, the best known today are the Veil of Veronica, the Shroud of Turin, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and the image of Edessa, which you may not know, but was actually by far the best known in antiquity. The Veil of Veronica, also known as the Sudarium, was allegedly an imprint of Christ's face on the cloth that he used to wipe himself on his ascent to Calvary. According to the apocryphal tale, the Sudarium would have been created around the year 30. However, scholars have noted that the earliest mention of the relic appears in the 12th century history of Giraldus Cambrensis. The 1,000-year gap separating the supposed creation of the Sudarium and its rediscovery suggests that the image was likely not authentic. This would have been an essential piece of developing Christian theology, and its absence for so long a period of time is highly problematic. The Shroud of Turin is also alleged to have miraculously preserved Christ's visage. It is supposed that the shroud was Christ's burial cloth, and that upon contact with his body, Christ's image was transposed to the shroud. Here you see a negative, which actually shows the image more clearly. Such an argument has proven more difficult since 1988, when a group of scientists published a report in Nature that dated the shroud to the 14th century. Advocates for the shroud's authenticity, have argued that the radiocarbon dating in the Nature article was inaccurate, and more relevant to the assessment of their argument here is that the Shroud of Turin, according to them, is the same as the third Agropoietos I'm going to describe, the image from Edessa. This is an icon from the 10th century that shows the image of Edessa being held. The image of Edessa, which is also more popularly known as the Mandylion, was the most famous Agropoietos in antiquity. It is also the image with the longest, most confusing history. Various versions of the legend existed at first. All versions of the story claim that Abgar, who's shown here, the king of the kingdom of Edessa, was sick and sought Christ to heal him. Abgar sent his scribe, Hanan, to Christ to ask if he would perform the miraculous cure. The first version of the Edessene legend, written in the 4th century, claims that Christ could not come, and that he informed Abgar by letter that he would send his disciple Thaddeus. After Christ's ascension, Thaddeus supposedly traveled to Edessa, cured Abgar, and converted the Edessene kingdom to Christianity. In the earliest version of the Abgar letter, in other words, there is no mention of an image. This first version was revised in the first half of the 4th century in the Acts of Thaddeus, which are the first to associate an image with the Abgar legend. The image, however, is not an Agropoietos. It's a painting. The bishop Rabula writes, "When Hanan the archivist saw that Jesus had spoken thus to him, he undertook and painted the portrait of Jesus with choice colors, since he was the royal painter, and brought it with him to his lord, King Abgar. When Abgar saw the image, he received it with great joy and placed it with great honor in one of the rooms of his palace." This story was revised again, twice in the 6th century, first shifting the Mandylion back to a letter before finally arriving at the story of an object as a miraculous imprint of Christ's face. For those of you keeping score, the Mandylion was a letter, then a painting, then a letter before becoming an Agropoietos, which it only did 500 years after Christ's death. If this feels suspicious, it's because it is, and several scholars have compellingly demonstrated reasons the Mandylion would be recast as a miraculous image in the 6th century. There were lots of socio-historical things going on at the moment that made this type of image very important. The point for us tonight, though, is that the Mandylion, and therefore the Shroud of Turin, are probably after-the-fact creations. While the Abgar legend first mentions an Agropoietos only in the 6th century, as early as 400, the story references a painted image. Is it possible, despite the lack of a relic preserving his image, that there was some representation of Christ painted from life? The earliest extant image of Christ, interestingly, did not appear until the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd. The absence of representations has been attributed both to the persecution of Christians as well as to the anti-iconic legacy of Judaism, which we already saw in the form of the Second Commandment did not allow the production of images. One reason that persecution is often cited as a factor in delaying the advent of Christian art is the location in which the earliest Christian art is found, subterranean burial catacombs. Although that theory has largely been discredited for reasons I'm not going to discuss tonight, the earliest of these catacombs are found in Rome, but there are also catacomb paintings dispersed throughout the Italian peninsula, particularly around Naples in the south. The images that you find in these catacombs depict a beardless Christ, a young beardless Christ, but this is not an aberrant image. It's widespread in late antiquity and can be found on artwork as far away as modern-day Britain and Greece. The beard is not absent from Western depictions of Christ, but it does not appear to enter the visual record until the early 4th century. Currently, the earliest known bearded image of Christ from the West is a relief of Christ teaching his disciples, made around 300, now in the Terme Museum in Rome. This relief is sometimes called the polychrome plaque, and it shows an early form of Christ and what I'm going to call his canonical image, with that long hair centrally parted and a full contiguous beard and mustache. This image appears in many other places from the catacombs in Rome, and it also appears in places as widespread as sarcophagi in France and vases in Syria. Indeed, it is this image that was used in one of the first extant icons, which can be found at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. Further complicating matters, in the following centuries, at least 2 other very different types of bearded image appear. The first, known as the Ancient of Days, depicts Christ as an elderly, bearded male with white hair. This is Christ, this is not God the Father. The second, known as the Syro-Palestinian type, depicts Christ with short, cropped hair and a beard. What should be emerging, I hope, is a period beginning at the end of the 2nd century that is characterized by imaginative experimentation with Christ's image. It is a truism that if Christ lived, he had only one likeness. And whatever the reason, the fact that the earliest conceptions of Christ's image were different, sometimes diametrically so, suggests that his one true image was unknown. This uncertainty was not lost on early Christian theologians. The point is perhaps best summarized and authoritatively so by Augustine. Even the physical face of the Lord is pictured with infinite variety by countless imaginations. Though whatever it was like, he certainly had only one. Nor as regards the faith we have in the Lord Jesus Christ is it in the least relevant to salvation what our imaginations picture him like, which is probably quite different from reality. So let's pause and take stock of where we are. Late Antiquity, the period between 200 and 700, coincided with the production of the earliest extant images of Christ. The first images appear to have depicted Christ either in his canonical guise or as the so-called beardless youth. As the period wore on, 2 additional variants emerged, the Syro-Palestinian type and the Ancient of Days. Yet, by the end of the period, the canonical image had still become the standard iconography for Christ. We also have established that late antique Christians had little idea what Christ actually looked like when they were producing his earliest images. This suggests that we should feel more certain of our stop sign analogy. That is, we have good reason to believe that Christ's earliest images were modeled on some prototypes, and given the time, Roman prototypes. The earliest theories explaining the origins of Christ's image suggested that Christ's iconography was derived from images of the Roman emperor. According to this theory, the earliest images of Christ, and I'm quoting a scholar here named Beat Brank, drew upon Roman triumphal art in cases where it was necessary to emphasize the kingly rule of Christ. Following this logic, Christ's frontal and symmetrical appearance in many images was an emulation of analogous poses of the Roman emperor. Scenes of Christ's teaching, surrounded by his disciples, have been likened to scenes of the emperor speaking to the people. And scenes of Christ entering Jerusalem have been likened to the emperor's triumphal entry to a city after a successful conquest. More recently, a group of scholars has attempted to provide a corrective to the imperial theory by suggesting that the image of Christ is derived from the iconographies of Roman deities. In this argument, Christ's canonical image is derived from the iconography of Jupiter, or Serapis, and the image of the beardless youth is derived from images of Apollo, or Dionysus. Yet a third theory, that Christ's images are derived from the portraits of philosophers, is actually not so hard to imagine either. Philosophers were widely portrayed in late antiquity, and while many had beards, not all did. According to this line of argumentation, the canonical image of Christ is related to depictions of charismatic philosophers, a group of quote-unquote holy men who were philosophers with magical healing abilities. And the beardless image of Christ was related to the image of what one scholar calls the precocious child intellectual, the Wunderkind. I'm not interested in telling you which of these 3 theories is right, since I actually suspect that they all are. That is to say, I don't think that every image of Christ was modeled after a god or an emperor or a philosopher. I think that some images were modeled after gods, Some were modeled after emperors, and some were modeled after philosophers. And probably a great many were modeled on some combination of the three. Consider, for example, a mosaic from the 4th century building in Rome called Santa Costanza. In the image, Christ is shown giving the keys of heaven to Peter, a scene known as the Traditio Clavium, the tradition of the keys. Here, Christ's purple and gold clothing is identical to images of the emperor at the same time, as his face recalls Jupiter, and his actions, in allusion to his preaching, are similar to philosophers. Each of Christ's images does not have a single prototype. Most images probably have many. And if this seems confusing, then it means we're on the right track. Reality is messy. All this ambiguity presents another problem. If the earliest images of Christ were based on Roman images of emperors, gods, and philosophers, then how is it that we can tell that an image shows Christ and not something else? This is really obvious. It's also really hard to answer. Recall the image from the Catacomb of Comodilla that I showed you earlier. How is it that you actually know that this image depicts Christ and not, say, Jupiter, since it looks very similar? I mean, you know it depicts Christ because I told you, because it looks like Christ, etc. But imagine you're a late antique Christian that doesn't know what Christ looks like. How can you tell this apart from the prototype? The answer, of course, is the Alpha and Omega that flank the figure's head and refer to Revelation 22:13, where Christ says, I am Alpha and Omega, very literal, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Compare this image with the Opus Sectile floor mosaic from the Roman port city of Ostia. This image is sometimes identified as Christ, but looking at it very critically, what attributes are there that are unique to Christ? The answer is that there are none. Halos were not used exclusively for Christian figures during this period, and as we've already seen, the figure could just as easily have been a philosopher or a nobleman. In fact, his garment, which is called the toga praetexta, was associated with certain members of the upper class. So here we have the kernel of an answer to the question of how we can know if an image is meant to depict Christ. The image must have an element apart from his appearance that unambiguously identifies the figure as Christ. Such an element is called a signifier. For my purposes in this talk, it is more than enough to note that there are three basic types of signifier that are used to identify Christ in late antiquity. The first and most straightforward method for identifying him is through the use of scriptural citations, which is to say, text that refers to Scripture and which labels an image. The text in these cases must be immediately adjacent to the image and should explicitly define the figure depicted as Christ, through either the use of his proper name or through the use of some other term that could be used only to refer to Christ. The depiction I just showed you is a perfect example with its alpha and omega. The second method of identifying Christ is through the use of scriptural context. That is, the depiction of an image that corresponds exactly to an episode from Christ's life as described in the New Testament. While the identity of a bearded image of Christ without any context might be confused for a philosopher or a deity, an image of the same figure entering Jerusalem on an ass unquestionably depicts Christ rather than Jupiter or a holy man. The third method of identifying Christ is through scriptural symbols, and this is really the bread and butter of the argument. That is, through symbols that refer to episodes from Christ's life without fully documenting the episode. The major scriptural symbol is one that you're all familiar with, the cross, and is included most often on either a book or in Christ's halo. The cruciform at first was virtually absent from Christ's iconography, perhaps because Christians were uncomfortable with the idea of the crucifixion. But over the course of late antiquity, it would become the single most important Christian signifier, and it's not difficult to understand why. At its core, the concept of Christ is and was defined by his sacrifice and his salvation for mankind and of mankind. No symbol better embodies that sacrifice than the cross, the instrument of that sacrifice. The image of Christ thus develops over late antiquity, such that our image of Christ on the polychrome plaques towards the beginning is replaced by the end of late antiquity with images of Christ like the painting from the Pontian Catacomb, with its starkly illustrated cruciform halo. One strange effect of the emergence of an agreed-upon set of signifiers was that it actually facilitated the creation of new, even more different types of Christ. Think about it. If all it took to identify a figure as Christ was to include a cross, then it became easy to make it clear to viewers that an image was meant to show the Christian God. For this reason, we see the emergence of the Ancient of Days in the Syro-Palestinian imageries, but both are almost always accompanied by crosses in their halos. Even the icon that I showed you earlier, it's not a great slide of it, but there are the remains of a cross that were painted on it 1,500 years ago. So the irony here is that in the pursuit of creating a standardized way of identifying Christ, early Christian artists provided a mechanism for the production of more and different images of Christ, which only made his actual appearance more ambiguous. So what changed between now and then? Why is it that at the beginning of this talk, we were all able to come up with the same image of Christ, or similar images of Christ, when we closed our eyes? Why is it not like late antiquity today, when almost any image would do as long as it had a cross behind it? The answer, I think, had quite a bit to do with the outbreak of Byzantine iconoclasm around 725. Consider that in the early 8th century, the Syro-Palestinian image was used so widely that we find it on a wall painting in Rome and on the back of a widely circulated gold coin minted by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, this coin which is displayed behind me. Yet within 20 years, the Byzantine emperor and the patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church had ruled that the production of images of Christ was idolatrous. Many of the images already in existence were destroyed. Byzantine iconoclasm would last on and off for more than a century, but after the production of Christ's images was reallowed, Christ is almost always shown in his canonical guise. How is it that the ritual destruction of images somehow sanctioned the image of Christ with long hair and a beard, as opposed to the other types? Here, I wish I had an answer for you, and I do hope to have one in the future with some more research. At the moment, though, I do not want to leave you hanging, and I will hazard a guess. I am greatly oversimplifying things, but the Byzantine iconoclasm was prompted by a very simple theological debate, very complicated, but very simple at its core, that had been a concern since the beginning of the religion. Can you depict God in art? You're all expert on this by now. This tension still exists today. On one side, antagonists of images, the so-called iconoclasts, literally image breakers, argued that it was impossible to circumscribe the divine and earthly media. According to this logic, since Christ was both human and divine, Christ's dual nature was by this point well established, it was considered heretical to pray to images of Christ, since they could not possibly encompass his divinity. And if you were praying to an image and not a god, then you're an idol worshiper. On the other side of the debate, supporters of image production, who were known as iconophiles, literally lovers of images, created an ingenious argument that ultimately won the day, although it did take more than 100 years. The iconophilic argument was that Christ was incarnate, and by definition must have had a corporeal form that we could see and record in artwork. When you pray to an image of Christ, however, according to them, you are not praying to the image. The image is acting as a conduit to Christ in heaven. The linchpin of the argument, and the truly brilliant bit, the new bit, was that iconophiles relied on a long philosophical tradition, called Platonism and repurposed during late antiquity as Neoplatonism, that posited that an image could serve as a channel for communicating with the spiritual if and only if the image depicted an authentic image of the person as he or she appeared in the world. By this logic, images of Christ did not somehow try to contain his divine nature in art. They directed the viewer to his divine nature, but they could only do so if they showed him as he actually looked when he was on earth. To put it simply, iconoclasm shifted the debate away from what Christ was and how he could be defined to how he actually looked. All of a sudden, the importance of ambiguity was replaced by a need for certainty, by a need to know that Christ's authentic appearance was a certain way. While this might explain how we get from many images down to one, it does not explain how the canonical image won. Much more research needs to be undertaken, but I suspect what happened can best be illustrated by returning, of all places, to the Mandylion, and specifically to the icon depicting it. The panel painting, which, as I've already told you, probably dates from the 10th century and can be found at St. Catherine's Monastery with its trove of icons in Egypt, depicts King Abgar holding the Mandylion. As we can see, the image definitely depicts the canonical type. Recall that it was not until the 6th century that the historical record starts to record the Mandylion as a miraculous image. Indeed, virtually no acropoietoi are said to exist before the middle of the 6th century, and they all appear very suddenly. Given that it is overwhelmingly likely that these images were made at that time, it is not at all surprising to see, as we do in this icon, that these images were fabricated to look like the image of Christ that was in widest circulation at the time, the image of Christ Pantocrator, the image of Christ in his canonical guise. These other variants exist, but by the middle of the 6th century, they are not nearly as prominently used as this image. So now, let's fast forward 300 years. The acropoietoi are no longer recent discoveries. They are, by the end of Iconoclasm, long-established relics. What's more, given the new imperative to depict an authentic image of Christ, what better source is there than an image said to be a direct copy of his face? In an ironic turn, then, acropoietoi may have been considered authentic models for Christ after all, even if they were almost definitely produced half a millennium after his death. Objects like the Mandylion, in other words, modeled themselves after the most popular image before Iconoclasm, which became considered the most authentic image after it. The story that I've told you tonight is a complicated one. The image of Christ did not develop in a smooth, linear way. It developed in fits and starts. In some ways, it has not developed at all. Even though many in this room and most people in the world have a fairly uniform conception of Christ, the image painted by Warner Solomon behind me has been reproduced more than 500 million times. A symbol as potent as Christ's image will always be subject to manipulation and reinterpretation. Whether in the Renaissance, where the beardless image reappears in a heroic form on Michelangelo's wall painting of the Last Supper in the Sistine Chapel, or the 17th century sculpture of the Cristo Negro from Portobello, Panama, images of Christ will always be reimagined in ways that allow people to define their God meaningfully. Thank you. As long as they're not too hard, I think we have time for a few questions. And there are mics set up here, but if you want, if I see a hand, I'll call on you and I'll just repeat the question back to, yep.
I'm wondering if you notice regional patterns based on, for instance, diophysite versus monophysite.
Yep. So the question is, although he alludes to specific forms of Christianity, types of Christianity, are there regional breakdowns by type? The answer is, my dissertation was a much more grown-up version of an undergraduate thesis where I thought the answer was yes, but the answer is no, not statistically significantly so. As a general rule, you do see bearded images more frequently in the West, or in the East, but there's actually no reason to believe that's not just an artifact preservation. What other questions are there? I see someone over there, so it's going to have to be really loud unless you want to walk up to the mic.
Okay. Is there any reason to believe he wasn't white? I mean, considering the region he lived in, that he was more dark skinned?
The question is there any reason to believe that Christ wasn't white given the reason that, or the region that he lived in? The answer is, sure, there are lots of reasons to think it, but it's a question I tend not to touch because it's not actually the thing which is terribly important to me, right? I mean, this is a really interesting topic. That's a question I get asked very, very frequently, but for obvious reasons, right, there are only bad answers to that. People can very easily get upset. So the most important thing is that the image is manipulated time and time again because of its potency. So that doesn't answer your question, but intentionally so. Thank you for asking it, though. I said not too hard, so what other questions do we have? Oh, I see a hand all the way in the back. There's glare, so you're going to have to wave me down from the back. Yeah, I got you.
If there's a lot of evidence for a common image because the image repeats itself so often, is there also evidence that they have standardized the image because of a law or coercive use of power?
Very good question. The question is there legal evidence which would suggest that the image was standardized in response to some edict. Nothing quite so plain. Where laws are passed that relate to the image of Christ, there are almost always things like do not depict images of Christ on the floor. There is some textual evidence that there is textual evidence that the most widely produced image of Christ was this canonical image. But no, there is actually no legal evidence, or there is no law that's passed which says you must produce Christ this way. So, if only, it would make life much easier. Maybe it's just waiting to be found, though. Unfortunately, the Byzantine Empire had meticulous note takers, so it would have turned up by now, I'm quite sure. But I thought there was another hand back there. Yeah.
A lot of those images showed a cross, but not a crucified Christ. What is that image of here?
That's a really interesting question. So this is one of the fun things about studying stuff which is buried under the ground, right? You can always find new things which completely change what you think. So for a long time, people thought the crucifixion didn't appear in art until as late as the 4th or 5th century. Ironically, it turns out that one of the earliest images which we associate with Christian art, and it's not clear whether it's actually anti-Christian art, it might be, is called the Alexamenos graffiti, and it shows a donkey who's crucified with what is probably some fairly illiterate reference, but a reference to Christ. So the notion that Christ was crucified and that was an important part of the religion existed from the very beginning of extant depictions, but we don't see definitive evidence for it until the 3rd century. So we moved it up a century on the basis of some amulets that we found, mostly from Syria. What other questions do we have? Hand here, and then you're over there next. We've got 6 more minutes.
When did the first images of the Blessed Mother appear? Do they appear at the same time, or are they more?
So that is a good question. You will all have noticed. So the question is, when do the first images of the Blessed Mother appear, Virgin Mary? And so as a so the cult of Mary doesn't emerge really until the 6th century as a standalone cult for worship. Images of the Mother and Child appear very early because, per a lot of the comments I made, right, the fact that he was born of a woman on this earth was another thing that was pointed to as proof that he had a human nature, right? God made flesh. So you do see images of the Virgin and Child very early. And I did not talk about images of a child Christ, which is another whole set of different variants that were in circulation. So they appear quite early as the early 3rd century. And they borrow their iconography from a set of imperial and religious, I think, less philosophical prototypes. The religious one is probably the cult of Isis, which was actually one of the most popular cults in the Roman Empire. And there are scenes, if you go home and Google Isis lactans or Isis nursing, you'll be shocked that there was an iconography so similar to the Virgin and Child. And actually, on your way out through the classic court, in that first case in there, you can see Isis seated with her son Horus, who I think the piece is actually called Harpocrates. His name changes towards the end of Egyptian history, and it, again, is very reminiscent of mother and child imagery. So that iconography existed. The other thing, which I think was mentioned in the Blade article, if any of you read it, is that during this period that I spoke about, there were a string of emperors that were younger than 10 years old. So at that same time, in the early 5th century, when you actually have at one point an emperor who's as young as 4 years old, you see images of Christ, a child Christ, seated on a throne by himself in at least one context. So you can imagine that the response to an image like that would have been very different, right, if you live in an empire which is ruled by a 4-year-old. Right? Sometimes we might feel like we're governed by a bunch of 4-year-olds, but so there was another question over here, and I think that is probably going to end up being the last one.
Well, I hope it's a good one.
Okay. If not, I'll ask another.
Right.
I'll take another.
In your research, have you found other earlier researchers asking similar questions, and if so, how far back?
So, yes, that is a good question. It's a loaded question because there's a joke among scholars that you never go after your father, you go after your grandfather, right? So people are starting to revisit this. right? Because none of our supervisors touched it, because their supervisors were working on it. So you kind of have this, like, every other generation, people return to the same topics. But so the first catalog of this, comprehensive catalog of the images of Christ, was done at the turn of the 19th century by a German named Ernst von Dobschütz, who was way more interested in documenting the different types of historical Christ. So he took a very theological approach to it. And there were lots of different approaches to the study of the image that have been taken over the years. But most of the major work was done through the 50s by Germans cataloging things, and then very few people have touched it since. There have been some interpretations. There's a school of French scholars who have sort of dabbled with it, but it's a fraught topic, right? So there are reasons to avoid it. I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. There is actually time for one more if someone wants to ask one last question. Although, which isn't to say that wasn't a good one. That was a good one. All right, there's a hand.
What about changes in his facial expression?
There are. So, Christ's death is hugely important to the theology of the religion. That doesn't mean that it's not uncomfortable, right? Particularly when you live in a world where no one really, right? If you're an antagonist to the Christian religion, one of your counter-arguments to its reasonableness is you worship someone who died, right? You see this in non-Christian texts. So although eventually they come around to depicting images of Christ's death, he's almost exclusively shown with no emotion, not in pain, not in agony. Of course, that starts to change, or changes dramatically. If you were to walk around these galleries, particularly walking through some of the medieval galleries, you'd see some scenes of Christ where he looks like he's in wretched pain. But the real shift starts to happen about the 8th century, where the crucifixion is depicted much more frequently, and you start to see some indications of emotion. So, all right, well, thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate it.